devices. I know the speakers would really appreciate that. And finally, it's my pleasure to recognize our presiding officers for this year's program. Charles A. Beckham Jr. with Haynes Boone LLP, Eric M. Van Horn with Spencer Fane LLP, Sean B. Davis with Winstead PC, Brian T. Cummings with Graves, Doherty, Heron, and Moody, and J. H. Ong with Munch, Hart, Kopf, and Har PC. They'll be introducing our speakers and keeping us on schedule throughout the conference, so we thank them for that. Now, first up, please welcome our conference chair, Eric Van Horn.
Thank you very much, Greg. First, many thanks to the hardworking team at UTCLE who makes this conference run smoothly each and every year. Hannah, April, Caitlin, and Greg. You always do an impeccable job of making sure that everything that's supposed to happen does happen and successfully navigating the challenges when the unexpected arises, often without any of us knowing. You're all truly first class, and it's always a pleasure to work with you and a privilege to see you in action, in person, and behind the scenes. Please thank them for their tireless efforts to make this conference as great as it is. Second, many thanks to the planning committee. It's a truly elite group of Texas' finest from the bench and the bar. The planning committee is a well-oiled machine. It's with the guidance and leadership of Professor Westbrook and the UTCLE team that they put together this incredible conference each year with only one meeting, which I can say is often the most thought-provoking, enriching, and entertaining several hours I spend professionally each year. So great job to the planning committee. Now, thank you for attending this year's 44th annual J.L. Westbrook Bankruptcy Conference. It's a truly homegrown conference that started literally in a backyard with Professor Westbrook, then Professor Elizabeth Warren, and a handful of others. The idea and goal was to create the premier annual Texas Bankruptcy Conference for professionals, scholars, and judges, which it no doubt has been, still is, and always will be. This year's conference has officially set a new attendance record, with a lot of us here from Texas and many from across the country. When I tell others from outside of Texas who don't know about it, and then they research it, I always enjoy hearing how impressed they are with the programming and speakers that they see from past conferences. Many first-timers are here today, and like many others after their first time, I expect to hear that famous movie line, "I'll be back." If you're Gen Y or younger, you probably have to Google that. As Greg mentioned, unfortunately, Professor Westbrook is unable to attend this year. Having known him for over 20 years, he would say that this conference isn't about him, it's about us. It's about our remarkable bankruptcy community, and that we should not let his absence impact the valuable education and networking experiences that his conference provides. Jay and his beloved wife, Polly, of over 50 years, have shared this journey from a backyard to the Four Seasons, hand in hand. They've contributed mightily to our bankruptcy community here in Texas, nationally, and internationally. Please keep them in your thoughts. We're also asking attendees to sign one of the placards that are displayed at the registration desk in the foyer. Now, I'll be turning it over to our presiding officer today, or this morning. He's a tall building bankruptcy lawyer from Houston who really needs no introduction. He's a stalwart supporter and contributor to this conference, always willing and able to be part of it whenever called upon. He's of course a close friend of Jay and Polly's. He's a true Texas bankruptcy living legend, Charlie Beckham.
Morning, y'all. And thank you, Eric, for the introduction. I'm not sure I'm a living legend, but I have been here almost 44 years in a row for every one of these things. Now, the nice thing about today is y'all don't have to hear me speak other than to do the introductions for this morning's speakers. So I don't know if they thought my commentary on bankruptcy law over the last 44 years has gotten stale, but it's certainly gotten old. But it's a pleasure to see everyone here, and especially people who have never been here before, but also all of the old familiar faces who are here. The great thing about this program, and it's been the cornerstone of this presentation over the years, is this opening panel, and which has had distinguished members of the bar speaking on it for years and years. And so we do have the band back together again this morning. Unfortunately, Jay, our band leader, is not here, but nonetheless, we've got a good returning group of speakers this morning. So I'm going to start off with introductions for them, and on lead guitar is Bernie Bass, the luminary from Lubbock, and Bernie has been practicing law in Lubbock for many years, and I tried a case against Bernie in 1990, and just as wily and clever as he is up on this panel, as opposing counsel, he's even more so. So glad to have Bernie back this year. Sitting next to Bernie is Demetra Liggins, and who's the illustrious Demetra Liggins. I have a case with Demetra this year. Wily and clever, and a lot of fun to work with. Has been a great experience for me, and I hope for Demetra too. So, and then the Sage of Santa Fe, Bill Rochelle, has joined us, and y'all may be familiar with Bill's almost daily commentary on the world of bankruptcy and what's going on. So I'm really looking forward to their presentation, and I'll turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Well, Demetra,
Good morning.
what have you got?
So we're going to start this morning with a Supreme Court case, Trump versus Casa. At first glance, this case doesn't seem much like a bankruptcy case because it isn't. It was actually about birthright citizenship. President Trump had entered or signed an executive order saying that we would no longer be recognizing birthright citizenship. And then there were 3 different district courts around the country who signed injunctions basically saying that that was, not going to work. So the Supreme Court took up the issue of whether the district courts can basically issue what the Supreme Court called a universal injunction. It's a 6-3 opinion that's written by Justice Barrett, but it's joined by Roberts, Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. So certainly something that they all, felt strongly about. It was an opinion that everyone was looking forward to. They thought it was going to be all this immigration stuff, and then the opinion came out, and it had nothing to do whatsoever with birthright citizenship at all. It basically was a procedural opinion that only addressed injunctions and whether a universal injunction mattered. The reason why we care about it as bankruptcy practitioners is we know that bankruptcy is full of injunctions. We have lots of types of injunctions that, create law or prohibit or disallow actions by both parties that the court has jurisdiction over and by parties who do not appear before our court. So when we think about the universal injunction, although they were looking at it under the Judiciary Act of 1789, it immediately makes you think about what kind of jurisdiction the bankruptcy court has, which of course bankruptcy powers basically derive from in rem or personal and subject matter personal jurisdiction. And then we get the subject matter jurisdiction from the code. But when we think about how CASA might inform things that happen to our cases, I think the thing that comes out the most is non-debtor releases, which everyone still loves to talk about. So now we get to talk about it in the context of this Supreme Court decision. So basically what you really think about is that the injunction starts, saying, well, what is a non-consensual or a consensual release? Is that an injunction? And we would call that, I think, a non-debtor, or certainly Rochelle would call it a non-debtor an injunction. So liken it to a class action. So in a class action case, the plaintiff is going to go and decide where they want to get their judgment and who they want to get it against and in what jurisdiction. And in bankruptcy, with these non-debtor injunctions, the defendant decides where they want to go and get a judgment against everyone. And so when you think if the Supreme Court is ruling that you can't basically, and I actually watched a little video when I was getting ready for this, and one of the guys says, you know, the court in Oklahoma can't determine what's going on in Tennessee, and the court in Tennessee can't decide what's going on. And I thought, well, that's exactly what we do in bankruptcy. We determine what goes on everywhere. And so that's why this opinion could have, you know, a stretching ramifications. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing about bankruptcy in the opinion. No one says anything about bankruptcy, but I think it's one that could be possibly instructive as we look at how injunctions work in the consensual non-debtor injunctions we have.
You know, I agree with you right down the line about everything. The Supreme Court was telling us to get a nationwide injunction, you've got to use Rule 23 for a class action. And so, just like Demetra said, I believe that's informing us about how in a bankruptcy case you get a non-debtor injunction, is by incorporating Rule 23 and following those procedures. However, the difference is, it's a sort of the opposite in bankruptcy of a class action. In a class action, it's the plaintiffs who are suing the bad guy using class action. In bankruptcy, it's the bad guy who are suing the plaintiffs. So I don't even know that Rule 23 works. But I think the Supreme Court in this case is telling us to look at Rule 23, and because there really is no procedure for the reverse of a class action, I think this case is some indication, or further indication, that non-debtor injunctions are damn difficult to bring on.
Yeah, but I don't think that it meant to really address releases, because we have opinions, you may have heard of some that are addressing releases. So I don't think it was actually for that, but I do think it could end up being instructive.
Good morning. Earlier this year, I ended up at a banquet seated next to a guy that I'd known for a long time. He was about 4 or 5 years older than I am, and was active in a lot of things that went on in Lubbock. And it had been a while again since we'd talked, and so I asked him, I said, Monty, how's Mary Ann, his wife? He said, well, she has memory issues, but I've got a pill for that. And I said, what's the pill? He said, I don't remember. Might have been paying too much for that pill. Well, I thought that was funnier than a lot of you did, apparently. You hadn't been there to appreciate it. Judge Larson in the Villarreal case had a bunch on her plate and decided the various subsections of 727 on discharge denials. In this case, the debtor's former spouse brought an adversary proceeding seeking denial of the debtor's discharge. Their marriage obviously didn't end well. They divorced back in June of 2022. The debtor was ordered to pay child support and medical bills totaling a whopping $745.62 a month. And they were to divide the proceeds from the sale of their homestead, and the debtor, the guy, had $47,000 from the sale of the home. He defaulted considerably in his state court obligations, but the debtor said, well, I'll just get out of that by filing a Chapter 7, in which he did. He said when he filed, he had $5.65 in the bank and about $4,869 in a savings account. Now, he got $47,000 from the sale of the homestead. He was making $9,500 a month and change while working 2 jobs, and he didn't list the sale of the house. In dealing with what was before the court, and this, if you have a 727 issue, you need to read this case, because Judge Larson does a great job in defending or deciding exactly what happened and what the guy was entitled to. The court first said that the debts that he was ordered to pay by virtue of the divorce was a domestic support obligation, so that was not discharged in for sure. But then he went on to say, and applied to the facts, to the elements, and the debtor's testimony in deciding about the loss of proceeds from the sale of the home said, well, the way he characterized it with his testimony was that he was someone who won the lottery and just went crazy. Now, some things are probably better said, or not said, or put a different way, but based on that opinion, you're reading down and you see what the judge is deciding, and she says, well, the denial based on transfer or concealment of property was not warranted. He's okay there. Denial or discharge for failure to produce adequate financial records was not warranted. He was okay there. Denial of the discharge based on a false oath was not warranted. So if you're debtor's lawyer and reading the law and think, man, but this is great. But the denial warranted of discharge warranted for the debtor's failure to explain the loss of proceeds from the sale of the home, well, the discharge was denied. Again, I don't know how you coach these folks. That was not the really way to just put what that happened, but he kind of testified himself into losing that one. So he won first, second, and third, but lost on the fourth, the big one. It happens.
You know, stuff happens. I think I've heard that before. This is not advancing. Now it didn't advance too much. Can somebody? Okay, there we go. This is what I think is happening this year in bankruptcy. The times are changing. Most dramatically, I think, in the Fifth Circuit, also in the Third and in the Fourth Circuits. There are 3 Fifth Circuit opinions that everyone needs to read in full text, whether you need to or not. And that is, first off, Serta Simmons, and then the second Highland Capital decision, and then finally the Sanchez decision, which I am reporting today in my column. There are 3 other opinions I'm going to mention in a moment that are significant in indicating that I think times are changing. Well, how and why are they changing? Now, later Demetra is going to talk more about Serta Simmons, but the bottom line here is that the Fifth Circuit says, at least in this case, there ain't no such thing as equitable mootness. And they were perfectly willing to rejigger the equity of a plan in setting aside confirmation. That is dramatic, to say the least. In Highland Capital, in the first time it went to the Fifth Circuit, as far as I could understand that opinion, it said that gatekeeping is the best thing since sliced bread. When it comes up the second time, they say, no, there is essentially no gatekeeping. And then in the Sanchez decision, which was handed down a week ago today, as I said in my column today, they are dramatically narrowing post-confirmation jurisdiction. It isn't enough, in fact, it's nowhere near enough, that the post-confirmation dispute really involves the plan. You got to read the opinion. It's dramatic. And then what else do we have? Of course, we have the Purdue decision from the Supreme Court, killing something that had been used for 30 years, non-debtor injunctions. Next, we have the best of all decision from the Fourth Circuit, where frankly, the Fourth Circuit turned around 180 degrees and says, we're not going to put up with any of these abusive cases by big companies trying to escape their debts without paying them in full. And then finally, there is the Bedmar decision, which I will talk about later, by a bankruptcy judge in Delaware, who is essentially saying that Texas two-steps are not going to work. Now, to me, this is dramatic. And I think we have judges, including even some bankruptcy judges, saying that bankruptcy no longer should stretch the rubber band. And it seems to me that Clearly, in the Fifth Circuit, if you do stretch the rubber band too far, the Fifth Circuit is going to pop that rubber band, it's going to hit you in the face, and you're going to be worse off than you were in the first place. So my suggestion to everyone is that you not try anymore, especially in the Fifth Circuit, to do something extremely creative, because you may get away with it at the lower level, but not on appeal, and frankly, not just in the Fifth Circuit. I mean, District Judge Andrew Hannon in Houston has, shall we say, abrogated equitable mootness. And I think that's what we're going to see. So my suggestion is don't push it too far, because it may blow up in your face.
Yeah, and you'll have to live with that. So the next case is about a Chapter 11 that gets converted to a Chapter 7. This is White versus the U.S. trustee. This was a sub-Chapter 5, Chapter 11, where the debtor just had trouble getting all his stuff together. He just couldn't follow any of the rules. He kept not, filing correct statements. They kept giving these sort of status conferences and show causes as to see, should he stay in Chapter 11, should he not stay in Chapter 11, and so finally the judge got frustrated and entered an order to say, like, you need to come and basically account for why you should get to stay in Chapter 11. Instead of doing that, the debtor converted his case to Chapter 7. And in connection with the Chapter 7, the bankruptcy court entered an order before, almost like a pre-ruling before saying, we're gonna hear you on your Chapter 7, but we're gonna talk about your misconduct, so to speak, in the Chapter 11, and if that can be cause for dismissing your Chapter 7 case. And ultimately, the bankruptcy court found that the way he conducted himself, the way Mr. White conducted himself in the Chapter 7 was grounds to keep him from being able to maintain a Chapter 7. But on appeal, and this is very interesting, the court said that that's not really the text, that there is no bad faith sort of implicit into a Chapter 7 conduct. The Chapter 7 has a different remedy that's available, and that is the denial of a discharge. And the Chapter 7 is also very different than Chapter 11 or even Chapter 13, because in Chapter 11 and Chapter 13, a debtor is coming to the court, they're bringing all their assets, they're negotiating basically new contracts and agreements with the court that they're going to comply with in their case. And that's not what's happening in Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, you're just sort of throwing everything to a trustee and letting them handle it. And because of that, you don't need good faith. You don't have to actually act in good faith in Chapter 7, because you can just be denied the discharge. I found this really interesting because the court sort of acknowledged that the behavior wasn't great, but that it just didn't matter. And I just don't think I'd ever seen a case where it's like, you can kind of act in bad faith. Doesn't matter if you act in bad faith, this is Chapter 7. And it's a reminder that in Chapter 11, there's this sort of good faith implied into everything that you do. And it is because you are signing new agreements, continue to have, your operations, your contracts, everything moving forward. And so that's one of the reasons why I picked this one. I thought it was super instructive.
Yeah, there's a nice split there. So if any of y'all have this issue coming up in your cases, take it up. You can find yourself in the Supreme Court. I think this is one of the most interesting issues out there. Love it.
In the Garcia case, Judge Parker gives us a great opinion on student loan dischargeability, but this time it's got a little bit of a different twist to it. If you have a debtor with a student loan debt and they'd like to discharge, you better read this case because it's a good refresher. And on the dischargeability of student loans, it still looks like, in my opinion, that you can just hardly get there from here, even with a little help from the Department of Education. So the facts are that the debtor had $99,122 in student loan debt. She paid interest over the years but hadn't done anything to reduce the principal. She had a master's degree in human resources, got a position doing that at Target, but quit this job because of her son's addiction problems. She got a higher paying job, which wasn't not described, but she was close to leaving it after her father became ill and passed away. And she had surgery to remove a breast cancer tumor. Now, Now, what the court was asked to do was to accept a joint motion for entry of a court consent judgment which stipulated that, in fact, she passed the undue hardship test. Well, Judge Parker said that's nice, and even though we had a deal, that was good, but he had a job to independently review the finding and the agreement. In baseball parlance, it looked like that the throw from the shortstop to first just didn't get there in time, but the independent review determined that he did. So read the case and it'll catch you up on student loan dischargeability. The note that the debtor and the Department of Education, they held hands, they went to court, they said, we've got this thing figured out, and the debtor ought to get a discharge. But then that old Bruner case comes to the forefront again, and of course the Fifth Circuit loved the Bruner case and fought it, and that deal became unwound. Judge Hale, if memory serves, said that he didn't think he had ever allowed a student loan debt to be discharged in all his years on the bench. And it looks like the only discharge that a debtor gets from a student loan is when he's out at rest haven. And then maybe the court or somebody would decide, well, did you do enough to stay alive? Here they had a deal here, didn't get it. So again, if you have a student loan case, you need to read this for a refresher, particularly Judge Parker's well-reasoned view of it.
You know, if there's anything Congress ought to fix, this is it.
Beg your pardon?
If there's anything Congress ought to fix, it's student loans. I mean, it's atrocious.
Meaning that they should allow,
Yeah, let you get out of it after 7 years or something. For God's sake, it's just, oh. And I feel sorry for judges because they spend so much time writing these student loan opinions. It's a shame.
Yeah, and Judge Parker, to begin with, you knew that the debtor was in trouble when he said, I'm glad you had this deal, but I've got a duty to independently review it. Well, you knew that was not going to end well for the debtor when he goes down that trail. Wouldn't accept the deal that they made with the Department of Education. So,
Yeah. Well, thank goodness I don't have any student loan debt. Here is a decision, Ishore, from the from the Fifth Circuit that I adore, absolutely adore. It has to do with Taggart, which is, for me, the opposite of adore. You know, Taggart was a case which really ended, shall we say, automatic stay violations. Because the Supreme Court told us in Taggart that if there is an objectively reasonable basis for believing you didn't violate the stay, then there's no stay violation and therefore no damages. Likewise, and more important, Taggart also says that if there is a fair ground of doubt about whether you violated the automatic stay, then there is no stay violation. That's important, fair ground of doubt. Now, I thought when Taggart came down that this was going to open the floodgates. People would come up with elaborate arguments on why it really wasn't a stay violation. But guess what? The Fifth Circuit didn't buy it in the Ishore case. In this case, the debtor supposedly sold his home to someone with the option to buy it back in a few years. The debtor went through bankruptcy, and then after discharge, the buyer tries to evict. The debtor reopens the bankruptcy case, and the bankruptcy court, as well as the Fifth Circuit, decide that it really was not a sale, it was really a loan, and therefore it was a stay violation. Now, here's why I think this opinion is very important. I gotta tell you, I don't think it was crystal clear that this was a loan. Not at all. I think it was more than plausible that it was in fact a sale. Now, what the Fifth Circuit did in this opinion was to go through page after page of analysis and finally conclude that it really was just a loan and not a sale. Now, I gotta tell you, that is not fair ground of doubt. That the Fifth Circuit went to the ultimate legal analysis, rejected what I think is a plausible argument, and then therefore says there's no state violation. And to me, this is laudably the Fifth Circuit, I think, almost ignoring Taggart. And I say, God bless the Fifth Circuit on this, because I think it's really important. The only problem is, this was a non-precedential opinion, so it may or may not be followed by other panels, but I bet you that it will be.
Was the conduct of the parties, like were the parties, at arm's length when they negotiated the agreement?
Yeah, this guy's, what was in a crack. And he was in severe financial difficulty. This was a vulture, basically, that was coming in essentially to steal his home because he wasn't going to be able to buy it back. So yeah, it's a good guy and a bad guy, but still, and I think that's important, Demetri, because without saying a word about equity, I think that's what the Fifth Circuit is doing.
Yeah.
If you're a bad guy, you ain't going to get away with it. Not in the Fifth Circuit. I'm through.
The next one is Ivanka Holdings. It's a case about 365. So this is a case, and it's in the Second Circuit, and Ivanka Holdings was an airline that filed for bankruptcy. They had two different lessors that they had leased 20 aircraft on. And when they did the leases for the aircraft, there were broker fees that were due in connection with them. But instead of paying the broker fees up front, the leases provided that they would be paid on a schedule.